Alright, hello students. Today I'm going to demo body paragraph 1 for the revolution essay. Body paragraph 1 is all about what are the conditions that lead to a revolution. Starting off in writing this section of our essay, you need to, as you always need to, read the directions. So the goal of this paragraph is to examine the political, social, and economic causes of the revolution that you have chosen to study for this project. And here in the directions, I have a suggested process for writing this paragraph. You'll notice that the suggested process is actually in a different order from the way that the paragraph will be laid out when it's finished. I suggest following the process I have because it's thoughtfully constructed in order to build off what you already collected in your step 4 document, as well as just follow a logical process. So the first thing that you should do is select your evidence. So we're going to use the evidence from the step 4 document that you gathered on the revolution. You should at this point have 3 causes of the revolution, those 3 different types of oppression, of course, political, social, and economic oppression that lead to the revolution. And we are going to enter those into this essay. I'm going to go through this process just looking at political oppression, and then you'll know the format that you'll follow for the social and economic sections as well. So looking up, the first thing that you would need to do according to these instructions is to grab the evidence from your step 4 document. So you should go to your PLP and open up step 4. I've borrowed a student's step 4 that I'm going to use. This student is looking at the Syrian revolution. So of course these are your primary sources and your pieces of evidence from those primary sources. I'm going to use the student's second piece of political oppression. The quote that this student has is, "A new constitution adopted in 2012 allows multiple candidates who must declare themselves in the coming weeks. But a new law requires them to have lived in Syria for the past 10 years and to hold no other nationality, disqualifying many opposition figures in exile, some of whom fled political repression." So, what we want to do is copy that evidence, come back to the step 5 task card, and paste that evidence right into the evidence section for political evidence. The next thing that we want to do, you would of course, when you're doing this, you would put in all 3 pieces of evidence. So you'd put in your political evidence, coming down, you'd put in your social evidence, and you would also put in your economic evidence. But I think you guys will get the idea when I just go through the first one, so I'm going to not take as much time as it would to go through all 3 with you. The next thing we need to do is provide context for each piece of evidence. So we have this sentence here. We need to understand what was happening with the government during the time of this evidence. So I would open up the context task card. And in this context skill card, you'll see the rubric as well as an example below. In the rubric, we see that context really comes up in 2 different ways. First, you need to provide background info that gives accurate information about the historical, political, economic, social, and or cultural conditions of the time period and source's origin. So we need to say what was going on in Syria at this time period, especially concerning political happenings. Second, we need to introduce the source. So we're providing a complete introduction to the evidence, showing understanding of the source by making connections between the time period and the contents of the source. So really this is going to be at least 2 sentences, one on background info and one on source info. Looking down at the examples. Despite the difficult and oppressive conditions of Syrians living in Aleppo before the revolution itself has further damaged their life. To illustrate the damaging effects of the Syrian revolution on Syrian society, the Huffington Post published an article in May 2014 that indicated, so it's really that first sentence that talks about, as I said up here, the background info, and then the second sentence right here that provides that source introduction. So looking back, This is a new constitution, but it's still providing oppression. So this new constitution allows multiple candidates, whereas before the revolution had started, there were no multiple candidates that were allowed to run for political office, but they must declare themselves, and they have to have lived in Syria for the past 10 years and hold no other nationality. So many people before this revolution had left Syria in order to seek freedom elsewhere because they were being discriminated against in Syria. And now that they're coming back, they're not actually allowed to run for office in the country that they're returning to because they were out of the country for the past 10 years. And in doing so, keeping themselves safe, but now not allowed to participate in the new government. So that's the kind of information that we would need. So in context, you could say, prior to the Syrian revolution, many political opposition figures. That means political opposition figures are people who disagree with the people who were in charge. So it's anyone who had disagreed with the regime that was in place prior to the revolution. Many political opposition figures had fled the country in order to seek asylum or safety in maybe more, let's just say in other countries. And we can say had fled Syria, might be more exact. And then here we want to really introduce the source and what this source is saying. So looking back to our evidence, this is a source from the New York Times. We might want to open it to see who is speaking. Anne Barnard wrote this article, so we can say, as Anne Barnard notes this is in the New York Times, in her New York Times article titled "In Syria, a Show of Democracy Amid Destruction." In Syria, a show of democracy amid destruction, comma, so now we've talked a little bit about what was going on. We've introduced the source. What we haven't done yet is this part here about shows understanding of the source by making connections between the time period and the contents of source. So we might want to say, as Anne Barnard notes in her New York Times, we might want to say here, as Anne Barnard notes in her New York Times article titled "In Syria, a Show of Democracy Amid Destruction," many of these Syrians were unable to participate in the formation of the new government upon their return to Syria, comma, because, and then we would just leave it at that, and then because leads perfectly into our evidence. So we've introduced exactly what was going on, that these people had left the country, and said once they're coming back that they're unable to participate, and then leading into this source, it explains that they're not actually able to take part in the cool new things that were happening, including the formation of a new and more democratic government. So in essence, it wasn't entirely inclusive as a government. Looking down here, the next thing that we want to do is explain our evidence. So we need to analyze the evidence and explain why that issue may have caused the revolution, or in this case, continued the revolution or kept things from becoming fair. You've already actually done this. This is the unpacking section from your Step 4 document. So you just jump back over to your Step 4 document. We got our quote from here. So over here, boom, copy that unpacking into explaining evidence part 1, and you are done with that section. So we're moving right along here. You would do these 3 sections of selecting your evidence or taking it from Step 4, providing context, and explaining your evidence for all 3 sources. And really, since you've already done the explaining evidence part 1 and selecting evidence, all you're needing to do is choose a quote and then give context for it, really, and then copy and paste the explaining evidence in. The next thing that you would need to do after you've done this for both political evidence, social evidence, and economic evidence, showing all 3 kinds of oppression, is write your claim. In order to show you how to do this, let's look at the claim skill card. And on the claim skill card, which you should be familiar with from the French Revolution demo, you're going to see that out of 5, claims need to be clear, organized, and preview the main arguments of the paragraph. It needs to be somewhat significant. So what we're really trying to do here is introduce that the revolution was necessary and show the causes, the political, social, and economic cause. So you could start this off with something like, the Syrian revolution was necessary, comma, because, and then you would want to introduce those 3 reasons. So you could say because political oppression kept people from participating in the government authentically. Sorry, my spelling is not so great right now. And that sort of introduces this first argument of people not being able to authentically participate in the government because they're kept out. And this comma should be over here. Comma. And then you would need to introduce social oppression, which I'm not going to do because we didn't cover that section. I wanted to save some of your time. So you'd introduce the social oppression that you'll talk about, comma, and then you would intro the economic oppression. So that claim does a really good job of saying the revolution was necessary, and then sort of previewing those 3 arguments that you've talked about throughout the course of the paragraph. The last thing that you need to do when you come back up to the top will be to explain evidence part 2. This is the part of explaining evidence that we never got to before, and I'm going to show you really quickly how it's done. Open up the explaining evidence rubric. In the explaining evidence rubric, you will see that this second part of explaining evidence, remember, in the first part, you're just telling me what the evidence means. In the next part, you're explaining thoroughly and accurately, if you're going for a 6, how the evidence supports your claims, and where applicable, you're acknowledging some weaknesses or gaps in the evidence. I'm going to show you the first part. Let's look at how the evidence supports a claim. So we now have our evidence of people not being able to qualify for a revolution, and we want to qualify for government because they left prior to the revolution. We want to link it up to show how it supports the claim. So we would say this evidence supports the claim that Syrians were politically oppressed because it denies any individuals who had fled the oppressive pre-revolutionary regime. And guys, I'm about to get cut off here, so I'm going to finish up the last few seconds in another screencast. See you soon.